And we are recording, and I will share the slides for those folks that have registered. All right, a few housekeeping ground rules here. Want to welcome everybody. Please stay on mute during the presentation. Also, please keep your video off. That'll help with bandwidth and the connection issues, if there are any. Also, feel free to use the chat. We want this webinar to be informational, educational, and it's for you. Everyone, to my knowledge, that's in this webinar participating, not as a speaker, but as a participant, you guys work in a state agency or in a large school district. So if things that we speak about today resonate with you, you have questions about, you want to ask your other colleagues about, please feel free to put that into the chat. There's going to be a Q&A session at the end, so please hold your questions until then, but it's okay to go ahead and chat those questions into the chat box. That way we can go ahead and be collecting our thoughts and prepared to answer those as we move on. All right, well, let's get started. Let me pull up the PowerPoint here. Okay. Sarah, I'll ask if you're able to see the PowerPoint.
No, not yet. I see your face and that's it.
Okay, good.
Not yet, Walt.
All right. Bear with me. And feel free to sign in the chat as well to let us know which state or organization you represent.
Now I see the PowerPoint.
Okay, great. All right, well, today's topic is Fact or Fiction, the truth about using data forensics for state assessments. And I am Walt Drane. I'm the Director of Education Services here at Caveon Test Security. And there's more people coming in, good Lord. It's hard to multitask. All right, sorry I got sidetracked there. So my name is Walt. I'm the Director of Education Services at Caveon. I am a former state assessment director, also former executive director of assessment and accountability at the Mississippi Department of Education. And with me, I've got a colleague at Caveon, and I also have a state. So Rhonda, would you please introduce yourself from Kentucky?
Sure. Thank you, Walt. I'm Rhonda Sims. I'm the Associate Commissioner in the Office of Assessment and Accountability at the Kentucky Department of Education. So pleasure to be with you on a Friday afternoon. Hopefully it's beautiful where you are. It is here in Kentucky today.
Sarah?
Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Toton. I'm a psychometrician and senior data forensic scientist at Caveon. Long title to say that I specialize in analyzing messy data. And I'm happy to be with you today. And thank you, Walt, for coming up with this idea and inviting me to contribute.
All right, you're welcome. So here's the agenda that we're going to follow. The bottom line is this: we want to talk today about what is data forensics and what can you get out of it. So the first question that we've got to answer before we get too deep into the weeds is, we need to understand what we're trying to protect. And we know, obviously, by looking at the screen, that we want to protect validity, but that's important because these test scores, these assessment test scores are used for multiple reasons. We use test scores for student performance. Are students proficient in a certain content area or not? Maybe these test scores are used by parents. Just how is my child performing in school? These test scores could be used by principals, maybe a teacher evaluation system or principal appraisal system. These test scores could be used in the accountability model to place a label or a determination on a school or a district. So it's definitely important that we are protecting the validity of these test scores. And we do that one way is through data forensics. So where does data forensics fall in the test security process? You'll see there's 4 components to the test security process, and data forensics falls into the detection component. Now, we would recommend that most of your efforts are placed in the prevention component, which would be policies, procedures, training, all of the stuff that you do great running up to testing that prevent test security threats from occurring. But again, today's topic is going to focus in the detection component, which is data forensics. So Sarah, I'm going to pass it over. Before I pass over to you, though, I'd like Rhonda to speak. Let me go back one slide.
Sure.
When I just think about the components here, can you
Sure,
talk to us
Walt.
about a practical standpoint?
Right, sure, Walt. When you're looking at this, obviously, we're in very much agreement with what Walt shared. It's more about preventing, trying to keep people from having a problem with good training, good materials, good expectations. But we also think there's a value in people understanding that someone's going to be looking more deeply at what has occurred. So that there's a real value in the deter process as well. We were very open in Kentucky when we started using this process many years ago, that there was a reason we were asking you to put the classroom where students were testing. There was a reason that we were looking at these things to just make sure that we could stand behind results and the data. And more importantly, I think it brought a level of sort of attention to things. It's a little bit like when we complete our income taxes annually. We want to do the right thing. We want to follow the rules. We want to make sure that we're doing everything correctly. But we also know that someone could be sort of looking at that. They could be auditing that. So we want to be very careful to make sure that people understand, this is just one more tool to make sure that when we use these results in, sort of a meaningful and potentially difficult way, that we can stand behind them, particularly as Walt mentioned, putting a label on a school. That becomes, I think, a very critical thing to make sure you're getting right. So, but Art, I so totally agree with your lead in there. And, we really work hard to make that prevent circle really large. But we also think there's real value in people knowing that we're looking a little deeper at things, that to keep paying good attention and detail.
Thank you for that insight, Rhonda. Sarah, I'm going to pass it over to you to talk a little bit about data forensics and going deeper into the weeds from where we've been so far.
Absolutely. So I just wanted to kind of weigh in on the last slide as well. So when data forensics becomes a deterrent is when you publicize the use of that. So you're saying, okay, well, not only are we doing this, we're going to, share that we're doing this. So everybody's aware and they know it's there. And that's when it really serves as a deterrent. So in terms of data forensics, like Walt said, we want to protect the validity of test scores. And we're using statistical information to do that. So when we're assessing data, we want to see, are there potential security threats? Maybe there's a security vulnerability that we could find from the data. Where do we have unusual patterns? Even if it's just something odd, I want to know about it and I want to know why it happened. And then, that might be a case where a security threat is present. It might not be. There might be a reasonable explanation for that, something odd, but again, it's just a quality assurance measure to protect the validity of those scores. And really importantly, the statistical evidence, we want to take it from the realm of statistics and move it into, okay, now let's break this information down and consume it and use it to inform and support the test security decisions. So here we are at our first fact or fiction. You only need data forensics if there has been a breach. Okay, so from my side, I'm going to say that is definitely a fiction. You don't know what you don't measure. You are responsible for the security of your assessments, and you have a due diligence to ensure the validity of those scores as best as you can. However, if you have had a breach, that's not necessarily a bad time to reach out about data forensics. That often happens. Often when there is a breach, that's when people think, well, now data forensics is really important. But if you set up a data forensics program before there's a huge problem, you get a kind of an easier lead in. It's not so much a baptism by fire. And also data forensics finds the most egregious things first. So if there's a whole lot going on, I might not be able to see what's in the smaller issues because of the bigger issue that's right in my face. You can't see a dog in a football field if there's an elephant between you and the dog. And so you're only going to see the biggest problems first. So if you do have a major breach like that, that's what your results will show. You have a major breach. And then once you address that major breach, you may be able to dig into some of the smaller things or smaller issues that are behind the scenes. So that is definitely a fiction. Now, I also really want to emphasize, data forensics, we don't want to be the testing police. I'm not there to say, you're doing things wrong, blah, 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 blah. I have statistics to show that. We really want to be a quality assurance measure, because this all comes back to fairness, right? We want every student to have the same opportunity to show their knowledge. We want to protect students who did not gain an unfair advantage. If some students had an unfair advantage, we want to address that situation. So really, we're trying to identify breakdowns of score validity and decide what we can do to address them. So this might be, okay, the proctors aren't proctoring effectively. Maybe they need more training. That's something that you can find out from data forensics. Maybe students were coached through an exam. That's a serious test security issue. You can find that out as well. Test forms have been tampered with, or content has been disclosed. Maybe students colluded with each other, or it just other irregularities that may require an investigation. So, we have the full range of something odd may have happened. Maybe there's an explanation we just don't know yet, all the way to serious test security breaches.
And in Kentucky, I'll add, Sarah, that for us, it was a data quality and quality assurance matter. And we felt very important to us that while this data can be derived in a lot of different ways, we really felt it was important to have someone with expertise in doing this kind of analysis. So, we had this program quite a number of years ago now. I think our first occurrence was like 2013. And so, but it really was around that focus of making sure that we had sort of independent verification of information and bringing together some expertise to do that independently.
Thank you. So the next fact or fiction is coaching by an educator can be detected with data forensics. This is true. It can be detected with data forensics. I might have given that one a little bit on the slide previously. But how you detect this depends on how that coaching occurred. There's several different types of statistics that we can use, and it really depends on what the actual patterns in the data are. One thing I do want to just address right up front on this coaching issue is that it will depend on the data available. It will depend on the type of test, what kind of statistic we can actually run there. But if you have a computer-based test, maybe we can use timing. Are they taking the same questions at the same time for all of the students in the classroom? That's unusual. We could look at erasures. And so, we can identify instances where that might have happened, but I do want to go ahead and say that we are not talking about intent or behavior. So when we look at these statistics, we can only go so far, right? We can find very weird situations where a whole bunch of students appear to be doing the same thing at the same time, and that's really unusual. But we're not going to make accusations based on what specific behaviors may have occurred, because again, these are just statistics. So without corroborating information, we're not going to make that jump to, cheaters, or talking about intent. Okay, next slide. Fact or fiction? The strongest data forensics statistics are gain scores. Gain scores are essentially where we have multiple data points for the same people or for the same unit, like maybe a grade at a school, a grade subject group. And gain scores are just seeing those over time and seeing if they go up or down. And this is a fiction. So we have lots of different types of data forensic statistics. But here I want to talk about how gain scores have a lot of possible reasons, right? So maybe there are circumstances at the student level or at the classroom level that we haven't accounted for that do explain those gains or drops. I also, when I say gains or drops, it's because, well, maybe we see unusual drops. What if last year's test scores were inflated? That would be an unusual drop rather than an unusual gain. So instead of just looking at this in one single direction, looking for increases in score, looking for drops as well can inform you about previous test instances. And so these are a score difference statistic. We're taking the score from one administration and comparing it to the score from a next administration. So these are not the strongest data forensic statistics available. Next slide. Okay, so this is my bread and butter right here, but I don't want your eyes to glaze over. So I'm going to do a few passes at this slide, one at an abstract level, kind of zooming in as we get more and more information about the statistics. So there are 6 categories of data forensic statistics on the slide, and I've color coded them. So in red, these are what I would call primary statistics. They're our strongest statistics, and I would feel comfortable taking action based on those results alone. The action that you take may depend on your state or where you're coming from, but I'm confident moving forward with only those results. The middle categories in gold, those are secondary statistics, and I would say they're not as strong. However, in combination with other information, I could take action based on that. Now, the final category in gray, I call those supporting statistics. Now, those are statistics that I would never use to take action. They only support other detections. Okay, so those are the weakest statistics. And aberrants, that top right group, those are actually, you'll hear them referred to as person fit. And those are a lot of what the literature focused on for a very long time. However, they are one of the weakest statistics in terms of data forensics. So I'm going to go over a brief explanation of what each kind of statistic captures. So similarity, the upper left, that's actually taking test responses and saying, well, okay, these two people, maybe they have all these matching answers. How unusual is that? And I'm just going to say that, if you have 2 really, really competent students and they have the same test, you expect them to have a lot of matching answers, right? So we account for performance. Because what's less likely is maybe 2 students have all the same wrong answers. That's unusual. So it's not unusual to get, if 2 people get the item correct, they're going to have matching responses if it's the same test. But if they get the item wrong, it is unusual for them to pick the same distractor repeatedly. So that's what we're looking at with similarity. And that does require kind of fixed form or a lot of item overlap. So that's the kind of statistic that you're not gonna see with CAT, or you're not gonna see with LOFT or other test designs like that. Answer changes. So answer changes are when someone selects an answer and then they go back and they change that answer. And what we're looking for here is an unusual number of changes that go from a wrong answer originally, are erased or are changed on the computer, and then our correct answer. What we're looking for there is something like maybe coaching. Sometimes we'll see like bathroom breaks, like before the break, they made all these answer choice selections. And then after the break, they came back and suddenly they have a lot of changes and now the answers are correct, whereas before they were incorrect. And again, answer changes are possible for both paper, pencil, and computer-based tests. It's just very different behaviors you're looking at there. Because sometimes you just see with computer-based, you have to define what an answer change is, right? So it's selecting an answer, clicking submit, and then coming back to that and changing that answer. The 2 categories in gold, first we have score differences. I already talked about gain scores, but we also have some other types of score differences. We look at the performance on scored items versus unscored, because I expect that students will have a relatively similar ability level on those 2 subsets of items. There shouldn't be a reason why they're doing really well on scored items and poorly on unscored items. especially since we control for the difficulty of those two item groups. And so here we're using item subsets to identify differences in score that might be unusual and might indicate that disclosure has happened or that this student has had access to that content. Up next is timing statistics. Obviously, you can only do these if you have computer-based testing. I don't think we can use stopwatches for paper-based testing. So we're talking about computer-based testing here. And we're looking for unusually fast responses or response times that are not really matching up with what the rest of the student population is doing. So for instance, if everyone takes a long time on this one really complex or hard item, and then we have some people who are just a few seconds on that item, you know, that's unexpected. So we look at this timing over the whole test to see who has really unusual response time patterns. And this helps with disclosure, especially because if you've seen the items before, you're not likely to take the same amount of time as everybody else, right? You're quicker. You've already read the items. You might not have to read them all again. And then finally, I talked a little bit about aberrance before. It's basically person fit. It's just looking at unusual patterns in the data. So maybe a student answers a very hard item correctly and a very easy item incorrectly. That's an example of an aberrant response pattern. And program-specific indicators, these are anything that is just specific to your program that helps you. So let's see. I also want to mention that with each of these patterns of behaviors and each of these statistics, we look at if that's associated with a score gain or not. Because if I see unusual patterns, but it's associated with a score drop or a lower score than usual, I'm not as concerned, right? I'm concerned where there is a possible loss of validity. So along with each of these detections, we're looking for a score gain.
And Sarah, you know, one thing from a state perspective, you know, when you look at across the board, if you run all of these, it can be an overwhelming amount of data. So I think part of the work as you work with Caveon is to look at how you want to prioritize that, what kind of policy you have in the state that leads to a prioritization. Now, Kentucky prioritized around the two strongest statistics. And we also wanted to prioritize about looking more closely at particular schools. So we had a top 10 list of sort of areas where we should be looking and maybe going for a little bit more engagement, maybe some visits, some monitoring, and that just helped with that identification. And in the early years of looking at the data, we would at times just be sort of overwhelmed. And frankly, unless you are in a department situation where you have a large number of data people who can devote their time to this, that's where that expertise of helping to narrow down can become very effective with the work that Caveon has done. At least that's been our experience in Kentucky with that prioritizing on those two factors, as well as doing some top 10 sort of list of schools to take a look at more closely.
And someone said, how did you determine this in the chat? And correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought you were asking about how we determined which statistics are the strongest. If that's the question, it comes down to what are the alternate explanations? What other possible things that are legitimate test taking could result in these patterns? With the red category of statistics, there's not a whole lot. There's not other behavior types that could result in that. Okay, next slide. Okay, fact or fiction. CAT tests are secure and cannot be disclosed. So this one is a little bit of a trick question. So CAT tests can be disclosed. It is harder to disclose a CAT test. Why? Well, with a fixed form test, there's one set of items. If they're disclosed, that's it, right? It's out there. However, with a CAT test, the next item that's going to be displayed depends on the performance on the previous item. So especially with large item pools, it is hard for a CAT test to be disclosed. Therefore, it is going to be more secure than a fixed form test. But sometimes there's a certain path into the CAT test where the first 15 questions determine ability. And then you could be locked into a passing score by 20 items. If those early items are compromised, you can gain an unfair advantage on a CAT test. Okay, let's see. Fact or fiction? There are strong defensible data forensic statistics for CAT tests. This has been a big area of research in data forensics recently. A few years ago, I might have said probably not strong or defensible, but there's been some really good advancements, and I would say this is a fact now. So we can't run similarity, like I mentioned before, for CAT tests because we have to have items that overlap for all of the examinees. But we have response time statistics that correlate really strongly with similarity detections. We can also do things like score differencing on highly exposed versus less exposed items. And those can contain really good information, especially when we use several statistics like that and we get a kind of a pattern of behavior or a profile of detections. So I think it's also important that defensible here could mean very different things, right? I could justify item level decisions very easily. If I want to retire an item based on data forensics, okay, done. If I want to invalidate a score, that's a different level of evidence that's required. So we would recommend at Caveon keeping the strength of the statistic that is used in mind when selecting the action. So typically we're only going to recommend action based on those primary statistic detections or secondary when there's additional information. Next slide. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about what groups we can analyze with data forensics. Next slide. Fact or fiction? Data forensics only need to be conducted at the school and student level. I would say this is a fiction. So there are many different levels that we can look at this data at. But if you only do data forensics at the school and student level, you'll only get information about students and schools. Whereas if you do some more levels in between, it can really help. So maybe we analyze the district level, and then we look at a school, and then we look at a room within that school or a testing room. And maybe there's a specific administrator. We can chop up the data into all these different levels, right? So here at the top, we have the exam, the forms, and the items. Maybe only one form is compromised. That would be useful to know. Maybe some items have been disclosed. That's useful to know. We are going to look at the examinee level. And then in terms of groups, we have, like I said before, schools, rooms or teachers, the district, the administration mode, especially with COVID-19, that's become something of interest. We could do an analysis that's literally remote administrations versus in-person administrations, broken down by grade subject to see if there are particular risk groups. We also can analyze accommodation groups or longitudinal groups and look at the stability of detections and scores over administrations. Rhonda, did you have, I think you said you had something to weigh in on this.
Right. Just to emphasize that, for us, and as I'm sure for many of my colleagues that are on today, the value in patterns and seeing patterns becomes very important. So we were very interested in longitudinally looking at school performance and what kind of pattern we were seeing per school across time. Sometimes that would maybe flag for a classroom even across time, but obviously looking to see if there's a strong sort of pattern coming through that. And obviously more data points is better, and a longitudinal approach was something we were interested in Kentucky.
I see in the chat that we have a question. What are your thoughts on score gains or losses in 2021 versus prior years? Given that cohort performance might be dependent upon who tests or quality method of instruction during the 2021 school year. Yes, so this is going to be an unusual year. We have some states that might be, going back 2 years in terms of comparison, 2021 to 2019. And I think there is some uncertainty in terms of longitudinal performance in general, because there's always the possibility for factors to have changed. However, we in general assume stability at the examinee level. You know, if we have an examinee who's top of their class, we expect that the next year they'll be top of their class, or in that relative range. Now, this past year has been really unusual. So I think it's just important to acknowledge that uncertainty. And it can tell you something, right? It might point out issues that you aren't sure were there, or even issues in access and how remote schooling is going. So it's definitely uncertain this year. I think it can still provide useful information, but it's really important to consider those other possible explanations for that change in score.
Sarah, I would agree that this year all states are probably going to be considering kind of their policy around this kind of work because of COVID. I think one of the things, it could just be a good informational piece, obviously, to look at that, even if you're not using it in your typical normal ways that you would use it. So I noticed we've got a couple of people making that comment, and I certainly would agree with that, because you would just, we've kind of used the term flexible and flexibility in Kentucky to some degree this year. So with a capital F, flexibility. So I think that's something to be mindful of. We've had some good points in chat on that.
Yes, absolutely. I also see a question, are you going to be looking at individual items and how they're performing across years to check their item characteristic curves to see if they're performing much differently? So it depends on, you know, if you reuse items over multiple years, we will look at those. And we also look at the performance of the items over the windows, because if an item was disclosed during a window of administration, you'll likely see an increase in the score in that item, or an increase in the unusual patterns associated with that item over time. So it just depends on the design of the test and how much overlap we have year to year. We definitely do analyze individual items over the course of a window. And we can analyze them over the course of multiple administrations or years. Okay, next slide, Walt.
Yeah, so I think this brings us to what we're talking about in the chat. There's a lot of ambiguity this year compared to previous years because of COVID. And your security threats may look different this year than they have in the past. So looking at those security threats, maybe you're a state that's venturing into remote testing. Maybe you're a state that's offering some sort of modified testing environment in a school building. How are those security threats going to be handled? And will you need to analyze data to look at that through data forensics? What groups would be interesting to you? Sarah mentioned a lot of different groups. And I would also say, can your vendor produce some of the data points to allow you to look at some of this in the form of data forensics? Because if your vendor can't capture the test administrator name or the proctor name, then that cannot be analyzed. So I think there's a lot of second and third order effects that have to be hammered out and developed as you decide how are you going to use data forensics in your program, and how does that change because of COVID. And then this last point, how has motivation to perform well changed? I would say maybe with the flexibility, Rhonda, that you mentioned, the flexibility is also been offered by the U.S. Department of Education in the form of flexibility testing the 95%. There's a lot
That's
of flexibility.
right.
So maybe the motivation to be nefarious in performance is not there like it has been in years prior to COVID.
I think this may be that as you analyze the data and what we get out of this administration this year, it may be, again, sort of more of an informational and give us sort of a new thing to look at as we hopefully get back into regular scheduled testing. I know in Kentucky, we've not had assessment since 19, as others have. And so, except for a few examples of where we were able to get something in before the pandemic really got underway. But I do think that every state is probably concerned with, what number of students realistically can we get tested this year? With a lot of our students on virtual and hybrid, and can we keep everybody safe and healthy and in school in person, which is obviously everyone's goal. So I do think it probably puts more issue on the policies you utilize this year around the data that can come out of forensics. I don't think it means you shouldn't at least look at what you got and apply some of the looks and processes to that. But I do think it might prove to be sort of more informational moving forward, and just give you a sense of what are we dealing with here after this year of such unusual instruction and such unusual American life.
I also wanted to point out a few things. So, what we consider failures of validity in this case is probably going to look different than other years, right? Maybe it's a parent helping a student as they take the test. If it's a remote administration, maybe it's a neighborhood schooling pod, and they're taking the test together. Similarity statistics could identify that, even without knowing that those are part of a schooling pod. And if you're using those statistics over all of the test instances, it can build those types of clusters and show you where those relationships are, even if you're going in blind and you don't know, information at that group level. So in some ways, the threats this year are very different, or they could be, depending on your situation. But a lot of data forensic statistics are still able to capture that information in a way that you might not capture if you weren't doing data forensics. Like I said before, you don't know what you don't measure.
All right, this next section is going to be about taking action. So Sarah did a great job explaining to us what is data forensics, why we should use data forensics, and all the different statistics that you can run and the data that can be provided to a state. But once you have all of that information in your possession, what do you do about it? And that brings us to this next slide, a question. Fact or fiction, invalidating a score based on statistics alone can be legally defensible. If you'll reflect back to Sarah's presentation earlier, where she explained the different colored boxes. She had red boxes, one for similarity, one for answer change. She had yellow boxes, score difference, and I believe timing, and then some aberrant boxes in gray. She said the answer to this question, and the answer is fact. You can invalidate a score based on statistics alone. And she was mainly speaking about the statistics in the red box that you'll remember, similarity and answer changes. And we'll go over deeper into this presentation how and what other supporting details you may want to have, not just statistics alone.
And Walt, can I chime in here?
Go ahead.
I think it's very important to acknowledge that you should be conservative. You shouldn't try to just act on everything. Be conservative and be very confident in the cases you choose to take action in. And that's why we match up the strength of the statistic to the level of action. Courts have held up the right of a state to invalidate based on stats alone, because we're not talking about cheating or intent. We are simply saying there is enough evidence that this score is not a valid representation of knowledge that we don't consider that a valid score. And that very much takes the heat out of the fire in terms of what we're talking about here. So it's important to keep that in mind.
So when we talk about taking actions, there are different actions to take. We'll read this chart from left to right, and we'll start at the top. So one action would be inaction. I'm not sure why you would want to run data forensics if you weren't going to take any action at all, and maybe the action is simply to inform best practice, lessons learned. But to do nothing seems to defeat the purpose of running the data forensics. So I would assume not many people fall into this category. Moving over to the right, this dark gray box, this would really be for your test publisher, the vendors that you work with. Maybe the data forensics that you're running are signaling to you to inform your vendor that maybe there's items that need to be replaced, maybe because they've been compromised, maybe there's forms that have been compromised. Maybe you're in an item writer workshop, if you do that in your state, and someone is taking pictures of the items. Maybe that's some sort of threat that you've seen. Maybe that comes out in some sort of data forensics somehow. I don't know, but maybe you could ask your vendor to replace or sanction item writers if that was a problem. Secure access to items, copyright, etc. Move down here to the left, bottom light gray box. And I think about this as a quality assurance or compliance at the state level. What does your data forensics inform you? Does it tell you which schools and districts may need a site monitoring visit? Maybe you have test administrators and proctors that were identified in the data forensics year after year. Maybe they're frequent flyers on the list every year. Maybe they need to have more training, better training. Maybe policies and procedures need to be updated. So we can see that everything in this section would pertain to the state. And then the last box over here in red, I would say that belongs to the score consumer or the student in this case. Maybe the data forensics acknowledges that there needs to be a letter of warning to the student if you do that in your state. Maybe the policy is to invalidate. Maybe the policy is to offer a retest. But everything in this box would pertain to the student. And I do want to kind of hone in on what Sarah mentioned on the previous slide, especially in light of COVID. I mean, just because you run data forensics does not mean you have to be a hammer, right? You don't have to be hard on the action that you're going to take. Maybe your state is more of a flashlight, right? And you're taking a flashlight approach to illuminate problems that are in your state, to inform training, to inform best practice, to inform how to make a more secure testing environment. So I think there's degrees that this can move up and down the scale of action to take. And that kind of gets us to this slide. What's the point if you're not going to do something, even if it's to revise those policies? And where you go on the spectrum really depends on your policies and your procedures. So that leads us to this question here. Fact or fiction, all you need to invalidate scores is data forensics results. And we said you could take action like to invalidate on data forensics alone. So in that sense, it's fact. But all you need, well, maybe there's a gray area here. Maybe this one is fact and fiction, a little bit of both. And we'll look at that in just a minute in more detail on this slide. When I think about processes that must be in place, and if you're a state that's beginning to incorporate data forensics, here are the steps that I would take. First, I would look at my policies and my procedures, whether that's internal business rules, policies, procedures, maybe it's state law, maybe it's policies that have to be approved by the state board or have to go out for public comment. You have to look at those things because maybe your state doesn't allow for action to be taken like you're wanting to do. So maybe those policies and procedures need to be written and identified prior to taking action. And then understanding the data forensic results. Sarah talked a lot about these different statistics and these different results. And Rhonda mentioned too about it can be overwhelming at times, all the data that is returned. So working with your vendor to really compartmentalize a lot of that information into some sort of report or some sort of layman's terms, because at the end of the day, you're going to have to be the one as the state assessment director or as the test security specialist or the program coordinator to speak about and interpret what these data forensics mean and why you're taking action, whatever that action is. And to go along with my being indecisive on the last slide about was that fact or fiction, gather additional evidence. Maybe it's not concrete. Maybe the data forensics results did not yield similarity or wrong to right in the red box. Maybe it was one of the ancillary statistics that Sarah spoke about earlier. So maybe more evidence needs to be gathered, like a seating chart or training materials or some sort of documentation to help support that this event occurred. And then you evaluate all of that evidence. And then you take action. And what's missing from this slide would be an appeals process. I would definitely advocate, especially if you're invalidating student scores, is to have an appeals process because there has to be some sort of due process that's afforded to the student whenever that that score is invalidated. Now, maybe your state says that there's not one. I don't know, but the state that I worked in prior to coming to Caveon, we had an appeals process, and that just seemed to be more politically palatable when we had to make action, take action rather, and especially when dealing with parents. The benefits of taking action, everything that you see on the screen here, is going to ensure that validity that we talked about earlier in the presentation. Promote fairness, a big one here, deter potential offenders. That gets back to one of those test security components that I talked about. Making it known in public that your state runs data forensics and you're going to take action on those data forensics acts as a natural deterrent. And test administrators and proctors and students alike are less prone to bad behavior, being a bad actor in a testing environment when they know someone's looking, if you will. It upholds their standards, protects your reputation, and you've done your due diligence as the state. So you've heard all this, you want to do it. How do you do it for your testing program? I would get started by asking yourself, what keeps you up at night? You know, what are those threats that you think about? And you know what those are. Every state's unique, every testing program is unique, so there's not a one size fits all approach that's going to be taken here. So think about what's keeping you up at night, and then ask yourself what data is available. What data is available by your testing vendor? Are they going to be able to provide you, if you're a computer-based testing operation, will they give you wrong to right answer changes? Will they be able to give you timing statistics? Will they be able to give you similarity data for your vendor to look at and to run? Ask yourself, what statistics will you compute? Maybe you don't know. Maybe you need to consult your TAC, your Technical Advisory Committee, or a third-party independent group, such as Caveon. What groups are you interested in looking at? Sarah and Rhonda both talked about the different groups. Maybe it's items only, maybe it's test forms, maybe it's examinees or students, maybe it's districts, schools, teachers, maybe it's all of it. How are you going to do that? And what groups are you interested in looking at? What types of information do you want? What action are you going to take? And if I were talking to a state that's just now looking into data forensics, I would say this last bullet point is very crucial, very important. You need to run a pilot. That's a recommendation and a best practice, because as a former high school principal, I would not want to have the goalpost moved here in the middle of a testing season to say, oh, now we're going to run this data forensic stuff. Well, what do you mean? We're changing the rules of testing. So I think you would probably want to run those for your state. Plus, it helps you see what's working well in your state, what's not working well in your state before you go live and before you take action. And I'm sure Rhonda can speak to this, but you would want to give your school districts an opportunity to say, hey, you were on the naughty list, and next year when we go live with this, you know, you need to get this fixed.
Right. I would echo that. I think if there was any sort of real learning that I would say from our experience in Kentucky, we started doing this in 2013 as a result of we did asked for our own security audit. We had ourselves audited for security. And in fact, I noticed John Olson's on the call today. He was our lead auditor. And so we asked for an audit, and several things came out of that audit that we proceeded to put into place. And then that sort of led us to looking at data forensics and start our work and our relationship with Caveon. But I think one thing that was very critical to us was we got out in front of this is what we're thinking, this is how it's going to be used, and that we really shared the data, started collecting the data before we tried to use the data as a trigger, so that everybody got familiar with it. And, you know, the processes sort of evolved and they became a little cleaner, a little tighter after the first year or two, that so the people understood, why are you looking to see where students are tested? And just even the questions around that. What if the student moves from one classroom to a second to a third classroom while they're being tested? So I do think that it's critical that you do the communication around it, that you try it out, that you evolve your use of it before you come down. And I think you used the term, Walt, earlier, a hammer. Because again, Kentucky has not used it to invalidate student scores. We've used it more of a look for patterns, a trigger, some way that says to us, maybe we need to do more investigation, maybe we need to improve our training. So we've not really been about invalidating an individual student score unless it's gone through a process of some investigation and it's gone before what we call our Kentucky Board of Review that makes decisions and recommendations to our commissioner. And every state will have their politically sensitive process that is what's expected among their policymakers and their leaders. So, but it is a process that while we've been at it since 2013, it has evolved during that time. And so I think it's okay to understand it is going to evolve, and you need to start in a more simplistic process to start with that.
Yeah, absolutely. So what I heard Rhonda say is, in a nutshell, if I were to give an acronym to it, because I like acronyms, I would say I heard plot. You have to think about data forensics: political, legal, operational, and technical, right? Those four components you have to work through before you can develop those policies, procedures, carry them out, because they definitely have the political, legal, operational, and technical aspects and components to it. It looks like there's 5 minutes left, so we have really gone through a lot of material, and I want to get to some questions. It looks like there's been some questions in the chat. I think we've been answering those along the way. If anyone else has a question about anything that we've talked about so far, please drop that in there in the remaining 5 minutes that we have.
I just wanted to also revisit this question about looking at individual items across years. Another thing that we can do is look at score differences between old and new items. So let's say that every year you add a certain percentage of new items to a test, or the bank, this portion of the bank is only used every few years. And that's something that we can do, is if those items have had a chance to be compromised before, we can compare performance on those items to items that are brand new or field test items. And we control for the difficulty of those items. So we know that those performance differences are not because one subset of items is harder or easier than the other, and look at performance differences that way. So that's another way that we can check information about items across years in order to give us information about examinees.
All right, thank you, Sarah. Any questions for us? Drop those in the chat and we'll address those. while we're waiting on people to think about a question, I will say that I appreciate everybody coming and joining this webinar. It really means a lot to me as the Director of Education Services for Caveon to see people have an interest in test security and interest in securing their assessments. And we will be doing future webinars. And if you're a state that would like to present alongside us, like Kentucky and like West Virginia from 2 months ago, let me know and we can make that happen. There's a question in the chat. Lead time for starting a data forensics program at the state level. That's a great question. And I really think it goes back to those policies and procedures, Mark. I know looking at and thinking about your state in Tennessee, your General Assembly or state legislature is probably in session. Maybe there's state policies and procedures or legal components that need to be taken into effect. So maybe the lead time is starting with that time frame. You know, when does that start? Because maybe your state, the policies and procedures that you have to enact to create a data forensics program, maybe you need more than just state board policy. Maybe you need some state law, maybe not. I'm just going to the most extreme case there. So I would definitely look at that. And then I would say, if I was going to do it now, I would start now. Okay, it's in the spring. We're in the spring of 2021. I would probably start in the fall with my pilot. So that means next fall 2021 and next spring 2022 with my pilot, and then go live 22-23 school year. I would take a full year to do a pilot just to see what kind of data you're working with from both your vendor on the assessment side and the data forensics side. I hope that answered your question.
And I was gonna speak to that as well. Yeah, if you want to do data forensics in terms of analyses for spring testing, it is often very beneficial to start talking in the fall because things that need to happen. We need to know what data we have and design an analysis for your state, depending on your data, depending on your concerns, and depending on what information you're hoping to get out of it. We need to coordinate with your vendor to receive those data, mock data first so we can configure our systems, and then live testing data. So there's a lot of preparation and planning that goes into it. So typically you will see, if you'd like to do data forensics in the spring, you start in the fall. If you'd like to start in the fall, we would start talking in the spring. That can probably be accelerated, but only, you know, the slowest ship, right? So it just depends on how all the components work together, and what the slowest moving piece is.
All right, well, we are here at the end of our time. Thank you very much for joining us today. I hope you've learned a lot, and be on the lookout for future webinars. I'll be conducting more in the future. And I will also get this recording out to you guys as well as the PowerPoint. And thank you again for coming. Have a great day.